This is a very important question. Obviously, a lot of efforts have been put into prevention in the community and thinking about how to prevent the issue of happening. But invariably, it will happen. But if this does happen, well, here's the most important thing. First, not to panic, not to become terrified or overwhelmed. Because the first thing to remember is that children, Baruch Hashem, are resilient. They bounce back with the proper hadracha, guidance, professionally, support, and otherwise. Children can do great. And yes, it will be a challenge, but the first thing to remember is you'll get through this. So that's one. Second is about how the information comes out. So we're assuming that you know. Well, how did you find out? The first conversation you have with your child or you hear about it is really critical. Asking with gentleness, with patience, and that the child not feel, oh no, this is something very scary, this is something very terrible. It's about letting them feel comfortable and safe for it to just come out and to just flow and talk to you. So therefore, what you have to remember in talking to your child is to be able to create a space of safety where they can just be honest and tell you what happened without a very strong reaction, almost casual, because they're able to then tell you more comfortably. Children, of course, pick up the sensitivities of their parents. If they see that their mother or father is stressed and nervous and anxious, they'll think, oh no, this must be something terrible. This must be something I have to be very afraid of. And therefore, sharing it, having them share it with you in a simple, straightforward way, relaxed, is very important. But together with this is trust and believing the child. It is very, very, very unusual, almost a statistical anomaly for children, and certainly young children, to just make it up out of nowhere. So when you have the opportunity for the child to say something, let them know, I hear, and you believe them. Together with that, the reaction that the first people they tell is very important, because that is able to set the stage for how they recover. One of the most predictive factors in some studies of how children recover in the long term is not how terrible it was, is not who it was, but the very fact of what was the reaction of the first person I told. When we're able to say, "Ay, that must have been terrible," empathy and care and believing them, we set the stage for a good recovery and healing process. Third, it's also important to keep in mind that the child himself or herself might feel in some way guilty, or in some way they're doing something wrong, because they might be talking about stuff that they don't usually talk about, and they might have a certain degree of shame. And that's why, again, it's important to let them know, we're so proud of you that you're saying something. You can even say it's a mitzvah, and let them know that they didn't do anything wrong. Because sometimes children take on these magical thoughts of, if I'm saying something, if people are upset, I caused it. And we want to do as much as possible to avoid that negative reaction. Following creating a safety, believing the child, and making sure that they understand that they didn't do anything wrong, then obviously following this up with speaking to a trusted professional, somebody who can guide the process further and offer the right support and the right guidance to move to the next step. This is a very important question, because invariably there's discoveries of this type of nature in schools, yeshivas, etc. Because this is where boys and girls spend the majority of their time. So therefore teachers really are an important part of the disclosure process. So the first thing, just like with parents, it's important to give over a sense of security, safety, and that it's a good thing that you're telling me and you didn't do anything wrong. That's one. A second thing that's very important to keep in mind is that sometimes there's an instinct that a teacher has to help the child feel safe, is to be able to say, okay, we won't discuss this with anybody else. This often comes from children's own desire to keep this a secret. I'm telling you something, and they worked very hard. They're courageous and brave to finally say something, but they're now afraid for it to go further. So they very often might say to a teacher or a Rebbe, I'm telling you something, but you can't tell anybody else. It's a secret. And the Rebbe, teacher, etc., has to feel, even though you want to make the child feel very comfortable, needs to overcome that to be able to say, I appreciate that, but at the same time, this is so important and we want to make sure you get the right help and everything you need. Therefore, it's important that I tell somebody and that other people know. This is particularly important given the fact that much of abuse happens in secrets and without people knowing. One other point that's important on this, especially when it comes to teachers and Rabbanim, is that the urge and the desire to really, I want to take care of this, and for me to, I'm going to do everything. It's very important for teachers, Rabbanim, Rebbeim, even therapists, to understand that this is a very important issue, and it can't just be gone at alone. And everybody involved in the process needs to know their limits of what they can do and what they can't do, and to set realistic expectations of themselves. Because it's not enough to say, I'll do it. We need to sometimes bring in the rest of the team to be able to work together. Schools, in the community, etc. Two more things that are important are the following. That it's very important, you don't need to get every detail. If you're asking questions, if you're trying to figure it out, you don't need to get every detail and get every nuance and every prat, because that sometimes can be overwhelming to the child. It's more important to get the basic gist of it and to simply get enough that you have some story that makes sense, even if it's not with the details. You, right now, at this moment, at that disclosure, are not doing the investigation on it. That's one. Secondly, it's very important that this moment, again, becomes a learning opportunity. Every moment becomes a teachable moment. And at this moment, you want to just remind them, it's great that you said something, and if something like this ever happens again, and hopefully it won't, if somebody starts to make you feel uncomfortable, you say no in a very loud, strong voice, you run away, and you tell somebody. And that's a very important point. And one last final detail on this is that to send the message of, we might not get to everything now, and you might think of some other points later. If you ever feel like you want to talk about it, if you ever feel like you want to talk further, just talk to me, talk further. This is particularly true with the parents, because you're creating a box for them to be able to how to understand and process the information. For the teacher, they might not speak about it so much afterwards. But for you, the parent, it's very important to know we spoke about it now, but you can also speak about it again in the future. This question is a very important question. Obviously, the community wants to do the maximum it can and to do it in a good way, in a good fashion, and that care is obviously wonderful. But sometimes it becomes necessary to go outside of what the community is able to do. That good intent and good desire has its limits, and the limits in very real ways. Sometimes it has limits by what it can do. It also has limits to how much monitoring could be put into place. Therefore, having real and formal monitoring such as, for example, having certain legal restrictions on the person, can also lead to greater safety in the future. And again, there's a limit to what we in the community are able to do in and of ourselves. We need to use the resources that are available to us from the outside. Even beyond that, it sends a very serious message that we take this very, very seriously. And it's not just going to slip through the cracks. And it's not something that will be tolerated. And therefore, this sends the message and becomes a deterrent as well. Even further, it becomes a message to the victims that we hear you and we are taking care of you. And it protects us in the future. Lo yaseh kemim kamenu. We don't tolerate this and we don't accept it. And supports at the same time the people who have gone through and have become victims to it. But it also has a shmira and a guarding aspect for future communities and even for other communities. Because sometimes what can inevitably happen is that the Rabbanim and the community leadership are very overtasked and are so busy and overwhelmed. So sometimes it can just slip through. And now, with an external monitoring, it really could create very positive change in the community. This is particularly important if you think the rate of recidivism, repeat offenses, of going from one person to another person to another person, and just piling up the victims, as it were, is a very real problem in this particular area of abuse. So therefore, having the external monitor protects. And sometimes it can happen that somebody moves from one community to another community. And even sometimes just sending the person out of the community, out of the good desire of protecting the community, could sometimes lead to a situation where they're not monitored and not known in another community. It also offers the very important piece that the offender, that the person who's done these things, get the help that they need for themselves and to protect in the future. And that can be enforced when the authorities are involved, and much less so if it's just the community with its limited resources. By creating a safe, positive, and environment in which people feel supported, that victims of abuse don't feel like an outcast for coming forward, but are able to get help and support and the fellowship that they so much need, that is a tremendous chizuk for them, but it's even more than that. It creates a sense of the community that we take care of people that are going through the difficult times. I just want to point out that this is a wonderful thing that has happened over the past while. That it used to be that victims not only suffered the trauma of their abuse, but sometimes felt that they were suffering the trauma of losing their community, not knowing, should I come forward, should I not come forward, and bearing it all in silence and with an inner shame. Being able to feel that the community, its Rabbanim, the Kehillah as a general, its professionals, teachers, see this is a nechama for all of them, is a support for all of them, even if it's not touching them themselves. So by creating a change in our attitudes and offering support, we offer support to everybody, current, future, and even past. So I think it's important to remember that in a large majority of situations, in an overwhelming majority of situations, abusers themselves were themselves abused. I want to be clear that that doesn't mean everybody that's a victim becomes a victimizer. The majority of victims are not victimizers. We have to be very clear about that. So given that abusers sometimes very often were victims themselves. This highlights the point that getting help and getting support can go a very long way to reducing the incidences of abuse in the future. So by teaching our children to be open and honest and forthcoming and to be able to protect themselves, it becomes also at the same time a way of minimizing the incidences of abuse. While it's unrealistic to think of a future where there's no abuse ever again, it'd be wonderful, but if we could think of a future where we're, as part of our education, that we teach people to recognize signs of abuse, stay away from it, speak to other people, and be open and honest about it, we really can help forge a future that this happens, but happens much less. And by giving support, when kids do disclose, letting them know that the community supports it, that they can feel comfortable talking about it, they're believed, and that they're cared for, we really can make a huge change in the lives of our children.